Mark Few, Tommy Lloyd, Gonzaga, Arizona. Let's renew this rivalry with both programs heading to the best basketball conference in America in the Big 12. Does that sound like fun? Let's discuss.
You are Locked On Zags, your daily podcast on the Gonzaga Bulldogs. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network. Your team every day.
What is going on, y'all? Welcome to the Locked On Zags podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. I'm your host and longtime Gonzaga podcaster, Andy Patton, here to give you daily reports all about Gonzaga athletics. We're going to have some fun today, folks, on Friday. For those of you who listened to Thursday's show, shout out to all of the everyday listeners out there. You know that I teased this, that I am currently, as many of you, most of you are listening to this, in Denver, Colorado on a mini vacation. So I am pre-recording this show on Wednesday. It is unfortunate timing to miss the final day of the transfer portal. So we will have more updates on the last minute transfer portal additions. We've already seen some big ones here on Wednesday afternoon. We'll cover all of that next week. But for today, I thought we'd have a little fun and look at some conference realignment conversations. So what we're going to do today is we're going to talk about two teams that could enter the Big 12, two teams that could enter the Pac-12, two teams that could enter the WCC to close out the show. I just want to make it clear here up front, this is kind of my dream scenario. These are teams that I think it would be really fun to see change conferences in this way from a college basketball perspective. If you're listening to this and you think, well, so-and-so conference would never do that, so-and-so team would never do that, you're probably right. And we're probably going to discuss those things in the kind of good and bad of each of these realignment things. But as conference realignment becomes such a prominent talking point, and it's going to pick up again this summer after the transfer portal window kind of dies down and some of that conversation ends, I'm sure conference realignment will pick up in a major way. And I thought it'd be fun to kind of talk about what are my dream scenarios here. And I'd love to hear yours. I'd love to hear your thoughts on things you'd like to see some of these conferences do. So we're going to lead things off talking about, of course, as I teased there in the opener, my absolute dream scenario for conference realignment, which is Mark Few and Tommy Lloyd buddying up again and deciding to respectively head to the Big 12 conference. This would, of course, require the Big 12 conference to accept both schools, but fortunately, that has been rumored. That doesn't feel like this super far away, mythical, unlikely to ever happen scenario. I think that Arizona going to the Big 12 is still unlikely. Whereas I think Gonzaga going to the Big 12 is much more likely. I don't know how imminent it necessarily is. We've been hearing for a long time that it is very imminent, but yet things continue to go by without it happening. I think the latest is that the Big 12 is kind of prioritizing figuring out what's going to happen with some of those those Pac-12 corner schools like Arizona. And if every day that goes by where the Pac-12 does not have a media rights deal in place, it makes it more and more likely that schools like Colorado or Arizona may potentially leave and go to the Big 12. I can understand why Brett Yormark, the commissioner of the Big 12, is prioritizing adding those schools, because as much as he is a huge proponent of college basketball, as much as you and I are huge proponents of college basketball, college football still rules, and getting to add a program like Arizona, even if they're not a great college football program, it is still a bigger priority to add that, or Colorado, of course, with Deion Sanders and what's going on over there in Denver. I think I can understand why they're kind of prioritizing that, and Gonzaga is a little bit on the back burner right now. But in this dream Andy Patton scenario here, we have Gonzaga and Arizona heading off together to join the Big 12 conference and reunite the rivalry. So we'll talk about the good and the bad of all of these moves, and we'll just kind of lay out what the conference would look like for each of these three segments starting here. The good here is that two elite college basketball programs join the best basketball conference in America. Pretty simple. Pretty simple. The Big 12 is absolutely loaded. It was loaded last year. It's going to be more loaded this year, adding Houston to that conference. They also add, BYU and Cincinnati and UCF, who don't move the needle as much, but adding Houston to a conference that already has Kansas and Baylor and Tech and Iowa State and VCU and West Virginia and on and on and on. And you throw two teams like Gonzaga and Arizona. Gonzaga, one of the most prolific college basketball programs of the last 2 decades, a team that's continually in conversation for national championships. Like, that would be incredible. In Arizona, Tommy Lloyd has won more games than any head coach in his first 2 years. There was some panic and some fear around him early this offseason when they did not land Ryan Nembhard. They haven't landed a ton of huge players, but then they go and land Jaden Bradley out of Alabama. Huge addition for them. They land Carter Bryant in the class of 2024, a guy who I think could ultimately end up top 5 in that recruiting class before all is said and done. This would be a tremendously fun move for Gonzaga fans, for college basketball fans. I think for Arizona fans in a lot of ways, certainly Arizona basketball fans would prefer to be in the Big 12 than the Pac-12. Obviously, there's more likelihood of losses, same that's going to happen to Gonzaga. But you want to play the best, and you get the opportunity to play the best here. The other good parts about this, clearly reuniting a rivalry. Gonzaga Arizona has been a rivalry in the past, of course, a non-conference, more regional rivalry than anything else. But if they were to bring it back and play each other in conference, Mark Few versus Tommy Lloyd in conference, my goodness. They compete for recruits already. They compete for transfers already. They have this tremendous history between the two of them of coaching together for 20 plus years. And now they play each other every single day in the best basketball conference in America. I don't know that it gets a whole lot better than that. Other good stuff, of course, you bring back the Gonzaga BYU rivalry. BYU probably doesn't want to see Gonzaga back in the Big 12. They're kind of ready to be done with them. But here they would be coming back, playing them twice a year in that conference. You'd see so many other fun matchups. I mean, Gonzaga gets to play Baylor twice a year, a team that they've had this kind of rivalry of sorts with the last couple of years. West Virginia, that would be a fun matchup to see continue going on there. Kansas, of course, Houston. I mean, the list goes on and on and on. Texas Tech is a school that Gonzaga has history with. So it's very easy to see all of the positives of a potential move like this. The bad stuff, also fairly easy to see. Arizona doesn't really make a lot of sense as an obvious travel partner for Gonzaga. You pick them because they're two prominent West Coast schools. I pick them because this is my dream scenario, and I'm going to pick the schools that I want to pick for said dream scenario. But realistically, would Gonzaga then become a travel partner with BYU? Would Arizona be a travel partner with BYU? Would they both be the travel partners with each other? I mean, the issues that I think have been holding up Gonzaga going to the Big 12 would still be prevalent here. I think adding 2 schools from the West Coast would be helpful. Obviously, Arizona would just be helpful from making this a premier college basketball conference. It would certainly do that. But I do think that some of those issues would still be there. Gonzaga would be a little bit isolated, a little bit on an island in the Big 12 conference. The other things that have been talked about at length about conference realignment, specifically Gonzaga to the Big 12, how much money would they get? Would they get a smaller piece of the pie because they don't have football? How would all that shake out? Would all the rest of their schools join the Big 12? Can Gonzaga financially handle that? Those are all questions that I'm sure have been deliberated on for months and months and months now. I know Thane is working on it. I know AD Chris Standiford is working on it. I know Yormark and the Big 12 presidents and athletic directors are considering all of that as well. The other bad news here, I don't know how big of a deal this would be, but you'd lose the Arizona State conference rivalry. I suspect they would still play each other in non-conference and for football and basketball. And I think that both sides would find a way to get over it in that situation. But, you don't really like breaking up the 2 state schools and bringing them out of conference. It's happened before. Florida and Florida State are not in the same conference for reference, but it's not something you see all that often. Before we move on, just a look at what this new conference would look like. They'd have to change their name. Now, way more than 12 schools in the Big 12 conference. But from a basketball perspective, this is just a rough look at the schools in general order of how prominent they are. Of course, you're adding Gonzaga and Arizona to a group that already includes Kansas, that already includes Baylor, that already includes now Houston joining the conference. Then you have TCU, Iowa State, Kansas State, West Virginia, Texas Tech, Oklahoma State, and then the other newcomers, BYU, Cincinnati, and Central Florida. It is a very, very dynamic college basketball conference, and man, it would be hard to take your eyes off of these games going forward if this were to happen. But what would this mean for the Pac-12? Well, it would mean the Pac-12 has lost USC, UCLA, and Arizona. That's almost a death blow from a men's basketball perspective, and they would have to figure something out on that front. Here's a fun potential fix they could do coming up after a word from today's sponsor, Built Bar. If you're looking for a delicious snack, but you do not want all of the sugar and calories, then you need the best tasting protein bar ever, Built. Built Bars are healthy and they taste amazing. Seriously, they taste so good, you will not think that they are healthy for you. What makes them so good? Well, for starters, they're covered in 100% real dark chocolate. That's right, real chocolate. And they come in unbelievable flavors like churro, peanut butter brownie, and cookies and cream. I'm not sure how Built does it, but these bars taste like a candy bar while maintaining amazing macros. They only have 130 calories, 4 grams of sugar, and a whopping 17 grams of protein. And now you don't need to wait around to get a box. For years, we've been talking about ordering your Built bars at Built.com. But now you can get them at your local Walmart or Sam's Club, where you can still get specialty flavors at Built.com. So head to your nearest Walmart today, walk to the pharmacy section, and grab yourself a box of Built bars. You can pick up a 4-bar box of cookies and cream, double chocolate, or coconut puff. And if you are close to a Sam's Club, run in and grab a 13-bar box with our hit flavors, brownie batter puff, and churro puff. You can thank me later. Built Bar, a proud sponsor of the Locked On Podcast Network. Well, I want to thank all of you for making Locked On Zags your first listen every day. And for you everyday listeners, you know we're going to come back with so much more transfer portal talk, movement, roster shakeups, NBA draft combine, all of that good stuff coming your way later next week as we kind of look at what the combine is going to mean for players like Drew Timme and Julian Strother, what the decisions are going to be for Anton Watson, Malachi Smith, and of course, any last-minute additions to the transfer portal and who those players might be that could be of interest to Mark Few and the staff. But for now, we're going to continue our dream scenario conference realignment. Once again, I would love to hear your thoughts either on these realignment topics or on any other potential realignment conversations that you may or may not want to have as we look towards what is likely going to be an off-season summer filled with conference realignment talk. So in this hypothetical situation, we have Gonzaga and Arizona leaving the WCC and the Pac-12 respectively to join the Big 12 conference. That would create a ripple effect for both of those two conferences. We'll close out the show looking at what the WCC could do, but we're going to talk now about what the Pac-12 could do. And for me, in this situation, without USC and UCLA, who are already leaving for the Big 10, without Arizona, if they clip off and join the Big 12, then I think the Pac-12's got to make some additions. And in my mind, the two additions that I would love to see in this dream scenario are San Diego State and Memphis. We'll talk a little bit about Memphis because I know that's not a school that makes a ton of sense to a lot of people, but San Diego State already heavily rumored to join the Pac-12. In fact, this is probably going to happen. It has been described as imminent for a very long time. Gonzaga to the Big 12 has been described as imminent by some folks as well, and it still has not happened. So there's still some things holding this stuff up. Of course, for the Pac-12, what is currently holding them up is that they do not have a media rights deal. I don't see why San Diego State or Memphis or Boise State or Fresno State or SMU or anybody else who has been rumored to be in that conversation for the Pac-12 would sign on without knowing what they're signing up for. It just doesn't make sense. So obviously the first step for the Pac-12 is nailing down that media rights deal however they can. Once they get that taken care of, we will see a situation where they probably will extend that invitation to San Diego State. Probably going to happen fairly soon. Of course, we've been waiting for this media rights deal for a very long time. Memphis is a bit more of a less obvious fit, but they are a prominent basketball program. They are a school that probably deserves to be at the Power 5 level and would be an interesting, fun, unique addition to the Pac-12 should they be have the stones to do it. Let's put it that way. The good news for this is that it would bring a lot of college basketball to the conference. Of course, and I feel like I don't need to say this, but I'm going to say it again. The Pac-12's priority is going to be football. The Big 12's priority is football. The WCC does not have football, so that's not their priority. But if you're listening to this and you think, well, the Pac-12 is not going to prioritize those schools just because of basketball, I know that. I know. We're having a little fun here on a Friday afternoon as you're listening to this. We're just talking about some situations that may or may not arise and some fun conference realignment that I think would bolster college basketball as a sport, knowing that that is not the priority of the Pac-12, the Big 12, any of the major conferences out there right now. So the good news here, it was, of course, bring basketball pedigree to the Pac-12 as they would lose all of their basketball pedigree without Arizona, without UCLA, without USC. That is a huge chunk of basketball prowess leaving the Pac-12 in this situation. San Diego State just went to a dang national championship game. They don't get a lot better pedigree than the team that just went to the big dance and nearly took home the entire thing. San Diego State makes a ton of sense for the Pac-12 geographically. They make sense as a basketball fit. Frankly, they make sense as a football fit as well. Replacing that Southern California market, San Diego, not as big as LA, but still gets them back in that fold, which they're missing now with USC and UCLA out the door. It's just such an obvious fit. It's the only thing that's holding it up is the fact that there's not a media deal yet. For Memphis, again, there's not an obvious travel fit here. That's the biggest issue. Memphis looking at this where, you remove Arizona, which is one of the closest schools to them geographically, although still not very close, and you add San Diego State, and then you say we're going to add a program from Tennessee. I get it. It doesn't make a ton of sense. I don't think this happens. For starters, the situation we're talking about right now, if they add San Diego State and Memphis, gives them 11 schools. I don't think that they want to sit at 11 schools. They would probably try to add a third school to give them 12. In this fictional situation, if Memphis were to agree to join the Pac-12, they would probably find some kind of travel partner out there to join them. SMU is the more logical fit. It gets the Pac-12 in the Dallas market, in the Texas market. SMU is not a very good basketball team, so it's not as fun from my college basketball dream scenario perspective. But if that's what we need to do to get the Pac-12 to add Memphis, which I think would be so fun, then I think we do it. Maybe it's SMU, maybe it's Tulane in New Orleans, maybe it's, could they go all the way to the A10, try to find somebody there? Well, first they could try Wichita State. I think Wichita State would make a ton of sense again, it's still like 8.5 hours from Memphis, from Wichita. So it's not like it'd be that close, but at least they'd be closer. And then you could have a situation, it's closer than Gonzaga and Arizona would be, at least for that matter. You add Memphis, you add Wichita State or Tulane or SMU, or you go to the A10 and you add Dayton, somebody like that. You have them as a travel partner with Memphis. All of a sudden, you got yourself a pretty darn fun college basketball conference, at least a better college basketball conference. Taking a look at what the entire group would look like, though, I got to be honest, it's still not a great college basketball conference. It's still not. If you add San Diego State and Memphis and you remove, of course, USC and UCLA, which is already going to happen, and then you also remove Arizona, here's what that new conference would look like. San Diego State's probably your front runner right away. They go from being the front runner of the Mountain West to the front runner in the Pac-12, proof that they are the kind of basketball team right now that is such a powerhouse that it doesn't really matter what conference they're in. Yeah, they wouldn't go lead the Big 12, but they'd lead a lot of other conferences. You got Oregon. Memphis is probably right in there in the top 3, top 5, at least, as a regular college basketball powerhouse, the way that they have been in the last few years. Then you have Arizona State, Utah, Colorado, Washington State, Washington, Stanford, Cal, Oregon State. And then if they were to make a final edition, whether it's SMU, Wichita State, Dayton, Tulane, whomever it may be, certainly out of that group, Dayton would be the more consistent college basketball powerhouse, would probably be a mid-level, maybe even a higher level team in the Pac-12 regularly. Wichita State is a little bit more inconsistent, but could definitely be a strong contender in this new Pac-12 as well. Not nearly as good as the Pac-12 with USC, UCLA, and Arizona, but still an adequate Power 5 basketball conference. It would be fun to see San Diego State and Memphis, 2 former mid-major programs, come into a conference like this and immediately establish themselves as 2 of the perennial powerhouses in that conference. Well, if Gonzaga and BYU are both in the Big 12, who's going to join the WCC? We'll talk about my dream scenario for that coming up right after this. All right, segment 3, still Andy Patton, still Locked on Zags, still going through some fun conference realignment dream scenarios here to close out the week and close out the transfer portal window for college basketball. We talked about a scenario where Gonzaga and Arizona go to the Big 12 together and renew a very fun West Coast rivalry. We talked about some moves the Pac-12 could do to offset the loss of Arizona, as well as the already happening losses of USC and UCLA. Talked about them potentially adding San Diego State, Memphis, and perhaps another school from that region to give Memphis a more obvious travel partner. But then we have the WCC. The WCC has already lost BYU. That has happened. They are not a member of the conference anymore. Starting next season, they will be in the Big 12. In this scenario we're talking about here, Gonzaga would be joining them in the Big 12 and leaving the WCC with 2 spots to fill, with 2 really premier basketball programs departing. Do they have any opportunity to add that kind of talent back into the WCC? No, you don't just replace Gonzaga with another program. You don't even replace BYU with another program. But if I'm coming up with a fun solution for the conference to at least continue to stay relevant, the 2 schools that I'm adding, again, my dream situation, UC-Santa Barbara, the Gauchos, as well as SeattleU. I have talked about SeattleU as a potential option for the WCC for a very long time. They are not the most exciting, the most lucrative, the most financially advantageous program that could be added to the WCC. They're not. But they have been rumored to be a WCC candidate for a very long time. Stu Jackson, the new commissioner of the WCC, who took over just a few months ago, he has a graduate degree from SeattleU. It's hard to imagine that that's not helping him. I have said this on this podcast before. I'm sure you everyday listeners recall, but I used to work at SeattleU. I went to grad school there. I also worked there full time as an employee. I have a lot of connections there. A lot of my best friends went to SeattleU. And this is a program that cares deeply about getting into the WCC. I worked there in 2017, and that's what they were talking about in staff meetings regularly. How can we get in the WCC? They hired people from WCC schools. I got hired there from the University of Portland. My coworker, who I shared an office with, she got hired there from the University of San Diego. This is what the powers that be at SeattleU are trying to do. They're still behind from a resource perspective. Their facility is smaller than any other facility in the WCC. I think they do play some home games at Climate Pledge Arena, which is very cool, but they're not quite there. But in my reality, I think it'd be very fun to add this up and coming program. I think Chris Victor is a fantastic coach. I think this is a basketball team that if added to the WCC, you would see them continue to elevate their game. You would see them succeed more, get better recruits, have that kind of success. For Santa Barbara, this is a team that's already doing it. Joe Pasternak is an outstanding coach. This team has added a transfer from Creighton and a transfer from Auburn this offseason. Johan Traore was a 4-star prospect coming into Auburn. He transferred after 1 year. He's joining the Gauchos. Really, really cool to see that. Both these programs make sense. Staying on the good news for this potential realignment, both these teams make sense geographically. They're both well-coached programs with Joe Pasternak and Chris Victor. SeattleU fits not only geographically, but they fit from an institution perspective. They are a small liberal arts Jesuit college. It just makes sense. They're very similar to Gonzaga. They're very similar to Portland. They're very similar to San Francisco, just in terms of the size, the student population, all of that stuff. And I know that that's important to the ADs. That's important to folks within the WCC to bring in schools that kind of fit that vibe. I think you also would potentially develop a really fun Seattle-Portland rivalry, the Pilots and the Redhawks. Seattle-Portland I-5 rivalry, we haven't had that since the Sonics left, and I think it'd be fun to be able to bring that back in a conference situation between SeattleU and UP. The bad news, well, clearly this is not an adequate replacement for Gonzaga and BYU. I mean, it's not even close. It's not even close. But I don't think that the WCC has options that are going to get close to that. They just don't. Maybe there are other schools they could add. Maybe they could try desperately to pull somebody like Wichita State or somebody like that from a bigger mid-major school. I doubt they would be able to do that, or mid-major program conference. That's what I'm trying to say. I don't think they'd be able to do that. Maybe they get a Grand Canyon, but is Grand Canyon significantly better? I don't really think so. They don't fit from an institution perspective at all. I think the WCC would rather go with SeattleU, who's maybe a little worse basketball-wise, but fits more institutionally. I just don't see a lot of good options. If the WCC loses Gonzaga after losing BYU, they're just not going to be able to replace those teams with that same caliber of talent. I think UC-Santa Barbara and SeattleU would be really logical replacements. The bad news for UC-Santa Barbara is they have a football team. They're in the Big West. They're not, there are some other schools that like Cal Baptist might make more sense from an institutional perspective. There are some other ones out there that might make more sense in that regard because they don't already have that football team. But if you talk about Santa Barbara, would they go independent? Would they stay in the Big West Conference for football? What could they possibly do to make this fit work? I don't know. There's a lot of questions that would have to be answered there. But USD has a football team. BYU, of course, had a football team. They were in the WCC. It's not like it is impossible for that to happen. The other bad news here is that the WCC could potentially / likely in this scenario drop to being a one-bid league. I would like to hope that somebody out of Santa Clara or Santa Barbara or somebody like that would be able to compete with St. Mary's, but I think that the WCC would probably slide down to being maybe very irregularly being a two-bid league, but they'd probably just be a one-bid league. And here's a look at what that conference would look like. Of course, pretty easy for us as people who regularly cover the WCC to kind of piece together how this would look. St. Mary's would be the top dog, without a doubt, in the WCC. I think Santa Clara, San Francisco, and Santa Barbara, the three kind of Bay Area schools, would all be the right behind the other Bay Area school, and St. Mary's is kind of the primary competition to win the league. I think St. Mary's. I think the way that the WCC would be a two-bid league in this situation is that somebody clips St. Mary's in the WCC championship game. I think that's the way that this would probably happen, but it would open up more opportunities for like Portland maybe they go on a nice little run and they beat St. Mary's in the WCC championship, make an NCAA tournament. Like, those things are a little bit more likely without Gonzaga in the mix. Anyway, you go St. Mary's, you go 3 Bay Area schools in Santa Clara, San Francisco, Santa Barbara. Then you have LMU in Portland, and then SeattleU kind of slots right in there, 6th, 7th place team in the conference, at least right away. I don't think they'd come in and be last. I think they still have more kind of upside with the current program than San Diego, than Pepperdine, than Pacific. So they kind of fit right in that 6-7 range. Again, I think with continued growth from the coaching staff, continued growth from the faculties and facilities and everything like that, kind of growing and getting more money in from the WCC, getting better transfers in because they're playing a better schedule. I think you'd see SeattleU start to creep up towards that top 5 eventually. People thought this for Pacific when they joined, and it did not work. So it does not always happen, but I do think that SeattleU as an institution could grow and become a successful member of the WCC in time. All right, that's my fun. Hopefully we all had fun with this conference realignment dream scenarios. I'd love to hear yours. Drop them on YouTube. Drop them to me on Twitter, Andy Patton CBB, whatever it may be. If you have questions about this, thoughts on it, please let me know. I love interacting with you all about this kind of stuff. Again, this is more fun, so I'm sure there are some ways that it's not super practical. I don't think Memphis is going to be an isolated addition to the Pac-12, for example, but I think there could be some ways that some of this stuff could work out and actually happen. And if this were to come together in the next couple of years, I think it would make college basketball on the whole a very enjoyable sport, particularly in the Big 12. Pac-12 would take a little bit of a hit, but it'd be fun to see Memphis competing in that conference. And for me personally, SeattleU competing in the WCC is something I really want to see. I know it's not necessarily everybody's jive, but Santa Barbara in this case would be a fun, very good basketball addition to this conference should this all shake out. All right, that is going to do it for me for today and this week. Enjoy the weekend, Zag fans. Hopefully it's nice and sunny wherever you are. We will be back early next week with more transfer portal coverage as we see some big names entering the portal here to close out the season. We'll talk about what that means for the Zags. We'll also talk about Drew Timme and Julian Strother as they perform in the NBA draft combine and hopefully raise their draft stock ahead of the draft in late June. All right, thank you all for listening. Happy weekend. And of course, as always, go Zags.